I have the pleasure of introducing our guest today, Alex Nowrasteh. Alex Nowrasteh is currently the Immigration Policy Analyst at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Economics from George Mason University and his Master of Science in Economic History from the London School of Economics. Previously, Mr. Nowrasteh worked as Immigration Policy Analyst at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and his work has appeared in a variety of places such as the Wall Street Journal, the Huffington Post, the Boston Globe, and the Journal for Economic Behavior and Organization. Also, Mr. Nowrasteh has appeared on Fox News and numerous TV shows and radio stations across the nation. So please join me in welcoming our guest today, Alex Nowrasteh.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and thank you to Praxis for having me all the way out here to Michigan today. It's nice to be in the real America and outside of Washington, D.C. So, as you could guess by the introduction of the title, I'm going to be talking about immigration today, which I think is a perplexing issue for a lot of libertarians, conservatives, free marketeers, people who consider themselves either on the right wing of the political spectrum or just libertarians themselves. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of the different issues today, but first I think we need to get started with some facts about immigration that are often misunderstood. For instance, what the current immigration system looks like. So, this is a highly simplified view of the current way just to get a green card in the United States right now. This is like the 35,000-foot view of it. Essentially, the only way you can get a green card right now is if you're very highly skilled, and you have an American company who wants to hire you, and they're willing to pay $10,000 to $35,000 in government and lawyer fees to do so, and only 7% of you can come from any one country, then you have a chance. Another way is if you're closely related to a current American, you have a fairly good chance of being able to get in then. And then there are some visas, some green cards set aside every year for refugees and asylees, people fleeing persecution, and about $50,000 a year on something called a diversity visa, or it's awarded by lottery. Now, if you notice, the one category of green cards that doesn't exist is ones for low-skilled workers who don't have family here. There is no green card currently available for a low-skilled worker unless you're closely related to an American. Say that again. There is no green card available for a low-skilled worker to come to the United States right now unless they're closely related to a current American citizen. That is in contrast to America's past. This is in vast contrast to the way things were under Ellis Island, where basically if you showed up and you weren't obviously a criminal or had influenza, you were able to get into the United States, or after 1882 Chinese. Another bad thing that they did. But this is in vast contrast. If we applied the laws that we have today backwards in time, virtually none of us would be here today. Because almost all of our ancestors were low-skilled, they didn't have family when they came here, and this system would have blocked them from doing so. So I'm going to run through a lot of the big arguments that are made against immigration today. There might be some other ones that you could bring up in the Q&A. I'm going to talk about why I think each one of these is either mistaken or has the facts wrong. Very quickly, immigrants take our jobs or lower our wages. We've all heard that. Immigration and the welfare state don't mix. Immigrants are going to cost taxpayers a lot of money by coming here. Today's immigrants don't assimilate. Part of that is that they did assimilate really well in the past, but somehow they don't do that today. Immigrants are more likely to commit crimes or become terrorists and violate the life, liberty, and property of Americans. The amorphous and ever-changing rule of law argument. This one is usually teamed up with an amnesty. So the idea that if we change our laws or if we legalize people who broke the laws in the past, that somehow violates the rule of law. That immigration, either illegal immigration or more expanded legal immigration or open borders which somehow violate national sovereignty. And then one that's very important to a lot of conservatives and libertarians, that immigrants don't support liberty. According to this theory, somehow immigrants are all going to come here, they're all going to vote for the Communist Party, they're going to throw us all in camps and take our property, and that'll just be that. So I'm going to talk about each one of these in detail. So first one, to begin talking about economics and the wage impact and everything like that, we need to understand a concept that economists call which is called the place premium. This is the expected gains in wages that an immigrant from each of these countries will make by coming to the United States without any other change. So we assume that they don't get higher education or anything like that. It's just by moving here. So we compare like to like. We compare an American with a high school degree with a Mexican with a high school degree, each with 9 years of education. And what we found is the Mexican, just by moving to the US, can expect a 3-fold increase in wages by doing so. Guatemalan 3-fold, Indian 6-fold, Vietnamese 6-fold, and a Haitian 10-fold. And this is in purchasing power parity, so it's adjusted. The median, if you take a look at all the developing countries around the world, is a 4-fold increase just by moving to the United States from their country of origin. It's an enormous increase in wages. As you all know, wages are determined by productivity, marginal productivity of the worker. So by moving here, by moving to the United States, these workers on average become 4 times more productive. And if you're from Haiti, you become 10 times more productive just by moving here to the United States. Now, economists like to do a lot of crazy models a lot of times, and I read all about them so you don't have to. One model they like to do is they like to say, okay, there's these big wage gains across the world by immigrants moving. Because there's these big productivity gains, what would happen if there was global open borders? What if anybody can move from any country to any other country and work there, and got those higher wages as a result, and this general equilibrium model did all the magical things that it usually does, and it reached equilibrium again? How much bigger would GDP be annually in the world? And this model produces different results based on what you put into it, but almost all of the results are between estimates that GDP would be $35 to $105 trillion bigger every year, which is somewhere between 50 and 150% increase in global productivity just by allowing open borders. The present value of that right now, and that's GDP every year going forward. So the present value of such a change, a radical change, is $800 trillion, which dwarfs any other single policy change that could be imagined right now in the world in terms of the expected productivity. And the reason why that is true is because immigrants are more productive in places like the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, and Australia, and Canada, because we have things like free markets, contract rights, property rights, rule of law, relative security, things like this. So this is an increase in global production, not so much a redistribution from the poor places of the world to the United States. But that doesn't really interest a lot of people. What interests a lot of people is how is this going to affect Americans? So there's a lot of papers out there about this. I pick the most negative paper in the entire peer-reviewed academic literature on the impact of economics on wages, and that's the yellow graph up here by Borjas and Katz. So what this takes a look at is all the immigration to the United States from 1990 to 2006, and how it has affected just American-born workers by their education. So I have less than high school, some college, college and above, all US born. That's the yellow graph. What they found is that during this time period, the most negative study found that 30 million immigrants roughly during this time period lowered the wages of Americans with less than a high school degree by about 4.5%, and lowered the wages of Americans with college or above by about 1.5%. But they found that Americans with a high school degree and with some college or above actually saw wage increases during this time period. And if you take a look at all the US born over on the extreme right-hand side, they found about 0 difference on average. More common finding by Ottaviano and Perry, which is replicated elsewhere, is the purple study. And they found that every single group of Americans by education saw small wage increases during this time period due to immigration. So the question is, you all remember sort of your Econ 101. You have a big increase in the supply of workers. Why should there be a wage increase? Or at the very least, why do wages fall in the first place? So one reason is little direct competition. Most immigrants are either less skilled than Americans, the average American, or they're vastly more skilled. They're sort of on the wings of things. They have less than a high school degree or a college degree and above. Most Americans are in the middle. There's no such commodity as pure labor. You can imagine that. If we increase the amount of people in this country by 100-fold who are tomato pickers, that's not going to affect the wages of accountants because they're not in competition. If we increase the number of astrophysicists by 100-fold, that's not going to affect my wages or anybody in this room unless you're an astrophysicist, because there's not competition between the two. So because most immigrants are different than us, there's not much competition to begin with. Previous immigrants, ironically, because they're more similar to current immigrants coming, that's where you see more of the wage impact, but not for Americans. Another effect is complementarity. If you recall, to lower the wage of something or to lower the price of something, that good has to be a substitute if I increase its supply. Most immigrants, because they have vastly different wages than Americans, are actually complements. By complementary, we mean they work together to increase productivity instead of working against each other to bring down their wages. And when you're complements, that means that the price paid for that goes up. Now, how does this occur? What's one big difference between new immigrants and Americans? What's one big difference? Yeah?
The education they've received.
Education's one thing. What's a more obvious difference?
Language?
Yeah?
Their primary language.
Yes, exactly, language. I don't know if anybody here has lived in another country, but everyone else around the world speaks like 4 languages. I don't speak any other languages. I'm an American. I only speak English. That's true for almost all Americans. This is an English-speaking country. To get ahead, you have to be able to speak English. Immigrants, when they come here, when they first get here, are not fluent in English by and large off the bat, which means that they have to work in jobs that do not require communication in English. Jobs that require brawn, that require manual labor and strength. What does that do to Americans with a similar education level? It boosts them up into jobs that require communication. Best example I can give you is a restaurant. What jobs do poor immigrants work at in restaurants who don't speak English? Dishwasher. Busboy. Janitor. Maybe they're the cook in the back who doesn't communicate with customers. What jobs do the Americans do who are low skilled? Waiter, waitress, hostess, manager. Jobs that require communication in English with the customers. Which jobs are higher paid? The jobs that require communication. That works across the rest of the economy entirely as well. Scale and heterogeneity is sort of a basic point. The amount of specialization in the market is determined by the extent of the market. You have a bigger market, more workers, you can have more specialization. Every worker can become more productive, and it shifts out the production possibility frontier. What about other reasons? Capital markets. Capital markets are dynamic. Investment adjusts upwards as the population increases. That means if there are more people who are customers and workers, people build more factories to produce goods and services for them, or they can expand output because of changes in prices. Productivity spillovers. Immigrants, because they're more likely, a lot of them are concentrated in the high end, they're twice as likely to patent than similarly skilled Americans. Entrepreneurship. Your average immigrant is twice as likely to start a job in any given month than your average American, probably due to self-selection bias. And the most obvious thing that always gets forgotten is aggregate demand. Immigrants buy things, spend a lot of money here, and that increases the demand for goods and services in this country, and then that produces employment in a lot of those sectors where they buy things. So your 2 most recent immigrant groups in the US, Hispanics and Asians, spend each year $2 trillion in the economy. That's a lot of extra productivity, a lot of extra money going to the demand side of things. So I hope you like graphs. So I have 3 graphs real quick. Labor market. Big increase in supply. Wages fall, quantity increases. Macroeconomy. Aggregate supply increase. There's more workers here, but these workers almost also buy things. So aggregate demand goes up. Back to labor market. What does that do? That increases the demand for workers, making up at least some of the decrease in wages, if not all of that decrease in wages which happened before. So that's a 3-point, very simple, dynamic representation of what happens to the economy. Now what about welfare? I'm a libertarian. I don't think the welfare state should exist for anybody. This argument is often made that we have a welfare state today. Aren't immigrants going to come here and take advantage of it and thus bankrupt us as a result of this? Few facts. Unauthorized or illegal immigrants are ineligible for means-tested welfare in the United States. Ineligible. Legal immigrants, if you come here on a green card, you can't get means-tested welfare for the first 5 years that you're here. If you're here on a work visa, you do not have recourse to means-tested welfare. If you're here on a student visa, you don't have recourse to that. If you're on a tourist visa, you don't have recourse to that. The only exception is emergency medical care. Show up at a hospital, you're injured, they have to take care of you by law. So what does this all mean? Poor immigrants, and what's interesting is, so poor immigrants are less likely to use TANF, which is temporary aid to needy families. That's cash assistance. That's what we think of when we think of welfare. They're less likely to use Medicaid and CHIP, which is medical insurance for poor people and children. SNAP is food stamps, and SSI is disability. Poor immigrants are less likely to use all of these programs than poor native-born Americans. And when they do use the programs, the average dollar value that they consume is far lower than it is for natives. In fact, so much so that if the average poor American used Medicaid at the same rate as the average poor immigrant, the program would be 42% smaller. Interestingly, immigrants have superior health outcomes than poor Americans. So that's another strike against Medicaid, I think. It doesn't even improve health outcomes. What about entitlements? Social Security and Medicare. Clearly these programs need reform. They're going bankrupt. Nothing can really save them. Medicare Part A, which is one of the big programs, if everything goes well, it's going to be bankrupt by 2024, which means it'll probably be like 2019 because nothing goes well with these programs. Do you remember Social Security? It wasn't supposed to start running a deficit till 2016 and it started in 2008. I mean, most optimists, anyway, that's a whole nother discussion. We can talk about that afterwards. But what's interesting is native-born Americans draw down $31 billion a year more than what they put into Medicare Part A each year. Immigrants, however, because they tend to be younger, because they tend to not get these programs once they retire, or they retire back in their home countries, and they're more likely to work, pay in about $14 billion more a year than what they take out. So although we can't probably save Medicare by reforming immigration, it at least produces a more positive cash flow than otherwise would exist, possibly making it so that when these programs fail, the reform will be less disastrous and more salvageable. Another point, the American welfare state is designed to help three groups primarily, mostly overlapping. Sick elderly women. Sick, Medicare, CHIP, Medicaid, etc. Elderly, Medicare, Social Security, women, TANF, SNAP, WIC, women and infant children, housing subsidies are primarily intended for women who are single mothers whose husband or boyfriend abandoned them and left them with children. Most of these programs are designed for that. However, most immigrants are healthy young men. So there's a fundamental disconnect between who the welfare state is designed to help and who immigrants are. Now, I'm still concerned about welfare. I think we all should be. It is far easier, politically popular, and possible to build an even higher wall around the welfare state than it is to build a wall around the country that keeps people out. We already have a fairly good wall around welfare state. I think we can make it higher and better. I wrote a long paper about how to do that legally. So what about budget deficit? Related to welfare, are immigrants going to bust the budget deficit? Are they going to increase the size of deficits and the debt ultimately? Now this is a complicated question because immigrants increase the size of the economy. Even your hardened skeptic will, immigration restrictionists will admit that. They increase the size of tax payments just by being here, maybe buying a few things. But they also increase government expenditures. Their kids go to school, maybe they go to school. By having more people on the roads, the government might build some more roads, things like that. So the question is, does the increase in the size of the economy and tax payments, is that greater or less than the increase in government expenditures? And this is a complicated question for a whole host of reasons, such as the timing of government programs. People receive a lot of benefits when they're younger, such as up to the age of 18. Everybody in this room was a fiscal waste until the age of 18. We all were. We consumed a lot of education spending. If we didn't, we weren't paying anything into it. We were driven on the roads, things like that. We didn't really work. But what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to work a lot between the ages of 18 and 65 to make up for that. And we're also supposed to save for retirement through Social Security and Medicare. So it's a lot of things you have to count over a time period to see how effective the budget deficit is. Last year, the Heritage Foundation came out with a study about how, an amnestying all the illegal immigrants in the United States would increase the budget deficit over a 50-year period of time by $6.3 trillion. Now, they did an interesting thing. They assumed that the economy would not change at all. Now, if you're like me and you like the Heritage Foundation, the reason why I liked them growing up was whenever some liberal politician would say, we need to double taxes to get double tax revenue, Heritage would say, nuh-uh, you can't say that. The economy is dynamic, it's not static. People are going to change their behavior when you change these laws. So if you double tax revenue, or double tax rates, the amount of revenue is going to be less than that. People are going to work less, they're going to save less, they're going to hire better accountants to hide their income, all this stuff. It's like, yeah, of course. That's like the number one rule of conservative or free market policy analysis is assume that the economy is dynamic. Well, they didn't do that with immigration. So they got a result that I bashed, and they made a lot of other mistakes in that study too. Like, this is not a discounted number, the 6.3 trillion, it just is added up each year. So it's kind of a meaningless figure, like through a financial lens. But myself and every other right of center and free market think tank in DC bashed this study to no end when it came out. The Congressional Budget Office, to their credit, actually used an enhanced Solo model and did a dynamic study of the estimated fiscal impacts of immigration reform. They thought it would reduce the deficit by $1.2 trillion over the next 20 years. I don't really believe that one either. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development came up with the most believable finding by a survey of all models and creating their own. And it's not a very interesting answer, but basically immigration doesn't affect budget deficits much one way or the other. Immigrants mostly pay for themselves. The increase in economic activity that occurs mostly covers them and their children. They found for the United States that between 2007 and 2009, all the immigrants in the United States paid about $5 billion more a year in taxes than they received in benefits, which is equal to about 0.03% of GDP, which is pretty much a rounding error. $5 billion is a lot of money to like normal people, corporations, and sane people, but when it comes to the federal government, it's pennies. It's not even worth, like it's mixed in with lint at the bottom of their pockets. I didn't even notice it. So if you're going to be against immigration or for it, I just don't think budget deficits are a very good argument that you can make either way. So what about assimilation? Are immigrants today and their children assimilating at a similar pace compared to previous generations? Now what do I mean by assimilation? That's where the immigrants and their children accept most American norms, cultures, behavior, language, things like that, learn it themselves. And Americans, but the second part of that is that Americans have to accept the immigrants as Americans and at some of their norms as Americans, as becoming American. Examples of that, things that didn't used to be American but became fine, Catholicism. If you recall American history, Catholics were not liked at all for quite a while. John Jay wanted to build a wall of brass around the United States to keep out Catholics. Insane things. Christmas tree was a German import. Kindergarten, another German import. Just think of your food. Lots of things that are now accepted as being fine with America and American. And then the immigrants learn the rest. So what about language, English language? Third generation. 100% of the descendants of Hispanic immigrants, by third generation, that means the grandkids of the immigrants are fluent in English. 78% of them English only, which sounds pretty American. 22% claim to be bilingual. Now, my father claims to be bilingual in Farsi. He speaks it like he's 3 years old. So I suspect the number of people who are actually bilingual is far smaller than that once you get to the third generation. Another poll done, a series of polls done, virtually all Asians and Hispanics in the U.S., immigrants, native born, everybody, accepts English as necessary to get ahead in the United States. I wager you would not see that finding if people did not want to assimilate in the United States. Jacob Victor, who was an economist, he used to be at Duke, now he's at Washington University. On all of the things that we can measure, religiosity, which is how often you attend religious services, how much you believe in the literal truth of God and the Bible or whatever religious text it is you follow. Also in terms of some of the religions that you follow. Civic participation, your likelihood of voting, the party you identify with, your service in the military, family size, income, and education. On all of these grounds, the current groups of immigrants that are here today that have been coming since the 50s or so, we see basically total assimilation by the third generation. That is indistinguishable from previous waves of immigrants. We see no difference over time. Patriotic assimilation, slightly different issue. Sam Huntington, who's heard of that guy? He's Harvard, yeah, he's Harvard professor. I think he's still at Harvard. I'm pretty sure he's still teaching too. He wrote this book in the 90s called Who Are We? And his main thesis is that Hispanic immigrants and their descendants are going to be less patriotic and less well assimilated over time. And he made out very specific claims, which thankfully can be tested. He's a great writer, very interesting guy. I recommend you read him. What's interesting is by 2007, on all the surveys that are available, patriotic assimilation of Hispanics is as fast as early 20th century immigrants from places like Russia, Poland, Italy, Germany, etc. After adjusting for age and education, American-born Hispanics are more patriotic than other Americans. That is, they are more likely on a survey to say America is the best country in the world, and other countries should be like America. According to these surveys and this work done in the Journal of Political Perspectives, hyphenation does not have any effect on patriotism. By hyphenation, you mean you call yourself an Hispanic American or a Mexican American or an Asian American or something like that. It has no measurable effect on the amount of patriotism that you express. So what about another form of assimilation? Like, why is assimilation so rapid? One reason I like is something called intermarriage or assimilation at the altar. This is a trend throughout American history, and it's continuing today. Most people, I'm focusing on Hispanics a lot because most people are concerned about that, who are concerned about immigration. First generation of Hispanics, 8% marry a non-Hispanic person. That's not too big. But second generation, 32%. Third generation, 57%. Pretty rapid intermarriage, pretty rapid blending in the United States. And what we see is this basically jumpstarts assimilation by one generation. If you have a mixed parentage. What's interesting is that a lot of these traditional surveys actually undercount assimilation because large percentages of the second and third generations do not self-identify as Hispanic in surveys. So if you have a survey and you're like, okay, I want to see how Hispanics do by generation, and I ask you first, are you Hispanic? And if you don't identify as Hispanic and you answer no, but both of your parents are from Mexico, clearly we intended to have you in the survey, but if you don't identify as it, then you don't count. So there's a bias in some of this data. Fortunately, there's a way to get around that. And what's interesting is Mexican Americans, by the third generation, only 17% have majority Mexican grandparents. Only 17% have a situation where if they look back at their lineage, 3 or 4 of their grandparents were all, 3 to 4 of them were Mexican as opposed to just 1 or 2. So fortunately, we can take a look and get rid of this sort of problem with self-identification. It's called ethnic attrition. These are the percentages of people from each one of these countries by generation who do not identify as Hispanic. Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, El Salvador, Dominican Republic. First generation, 1.1% of Mexican immigrants do not self-identify as Hispanic. I don't know why. Maybe they answered incorrectly. Maybe they actually weren't. Maybe they were black. Second generation, 5.4% don't. Okay, that's kind of an increase. Puerto Ricans, they're not immigrants technically, but they have a lot of the same characteristics, so they counted, 3.6 to 11.3. And second generation, by the way, is their kids. First generation of the immigrants. Cubans, 2.2 to 18. Pretty good jump. El Salvadorans, 3.1 to 78. 78% of second generation El Salvadorans do not identify as Hispanic. I thought that number was insane, and I didn't believe it. I didn't include this for a long time in my presentations, until I gave a presentation to a group of El Salvadorans, parents, the kids of El Salvadoran immigrants in the United States, and I asked them, like, if that makes sense, and they're like, oh yeah. Like, we don't, we left for good reason. Like, we have no good feelings about that place. They're like, okay, so then I included it. Dominican Republic, it jumps from 10 to 17%. What about third generation? Now, the blue here, and this is all third generation, this is relevant ethnicity on both sides of the family. Red is relevant ethnicity on only one side of the family. So you can tell, if you keep all all your grandparents and all your parents are from Mexico, you're gonna identify as Hispanic. Only 1.8% of you do not. Puerto Ricans, same thing. Cubans, El Salvadorans, 26% of you are not. There we go. But if you're relevant ethnicity on only one side of the family, and remember the rate of intermarriage, it's on one side of the family, you're much less likely to. 45% of third generation Mexicans who only have that ethnicity on one side do not consider themselves to be Hispanic. 58% of Puerto Ricans, 63% of Cubans, 96% of El Salvadorans, 48% of Dominican Republicans. So I think that's a great sign that people are shedding their other identities. Even though I don't think it matters a whole lot, they are shedding their other identities while assimilating into the United States, partly through intermarriage, but also through other ways. What about Asians, the other big group of American immigrants today? First generation, second generation who do not identify as Asian. Blue is first generation. Chinese 1.8, I don't know what they're thinking. Indians, I don't know, South Asian maybe, I don't know, maybe this thing. Japanese 3.4, Koreans 4.1. I think these blue people probably just misread or misfilled it out. Second generation though, who do not, I don't think have that excuse. 18%. Second generation Chinese do not identify as Asian, 37% Indian, 32.3% Japanese, 21% Korean, 22% Filipino. Pretty dramatic attrition. What about third generation? Well, it shoots up. Red is where there's intermarriage, blue is when there's not. What's amazing to me are the Koreans. Like, that is amazing. If you have all Korean parents and grandparents in the United States, and your grandparents came here, you 100% identify as Asian. So that is an interesting finding. But we see this intermarriage, Chinese, Indian, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, and there's high rates of intermarriage for these groups, an enormous amount of ethnic attrition in terms of self-identification. How do we compare this, though? I mean, that's all kind of meaningless, though, if we had nothing to compare it to, right? We have this bias about assimilation in America's past and how fast it was and how complete it was. How was it back then? Well, I argue that it was a lot worse than we give it credit for. Protestants burned down St. Mary's Church in New York in 1831 in a violent riot prompted by Irish immigration into the city. They also burned down a convent school in Boston in 1834. They burned down numerous Catholic churches in Philadelphia in 1844, lynched 10 Catholics, specifically in St. Louis in 1954, killed 100 Catholics and burned the Catholic section of town on Bloody Monday. And you can't differentiate between anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant riots at these times. Catholicism and immigration were linked. Most immigrants back then were Catholic, just like they have been up until today in each year, have been Catholic. John Hughes. Anybody ever heard of John Hughes? He was the most famous Irish American at that time in the mid-1800s. He was a Catholic bishop of New York. When all this craziness and violence was going on, he said if a single Catholic church is burned in New York, the city will become a second Moscow. That's reference to Napoleon burning down Moscow and sacking the city. No Catholic churches were burned, by the way, because the Irish were a huge group in that city and scared the crap out of the people who would have done that. Other forms of violence, 28 Chinese were murdered in a massacre in Wyoming in 1885. 11 Italians were lynched in New York in 1891, the largest mass lynching in American history. This stuff, I think, puts the brakes on assimilation by creating a violent atmosphere that makes people upset and not really willing to deal with the rest of the Americans around them. I think that's the most likely outcome. There is nothing comparable to this in modern America. Not even close. Nothing even close. Almost all the violence done against immigrants today in the United States is done by the government, deporting people, not done by other Americans who are upset at them. So unassimilable cultures, this is an argument made today against a couple groups, specifically Hispanics, Muslims, Africans, and Indians, who are newer immigrant groups, I guess. It was made, the same claims were made, and they were made forcefully, and they were made with a lot of evidence, and they were made based on things like the Protestant work ethic and all these other things about our culture and our characteristics and our traditions and our race and everything else. It was made about Catholics, Jews, Germans, Irish, Italians, Chinese, Japanese. We know how silly those were back then. I'm not sure the differences are greater today for all these other different groups than they are for these groups right here in the United States. Interesting facts, I guess, about what it means. Back in America's past, what it meant to be white, like you might take a look at these and be like, okay, a lot of these same groups come from Europe, they're white, they share the same European traditions, perhaps there's a lot of overlap. Well, the Irish weren't considered white until the 1930s. The New York Times commented frequently, it said about whites and Irish, they were considered a different race for the entire 19th century. Germans were considered a different race in the 1700s and early 1800s. Ben Franklin called them swarthy, which is hilarious. Italians were considered a different race up to the 1940s. A lot of nasty names used to describe them, like different racial characteristics. Chinese and Japanese are still considered that. The idea that an Irish immigrant from the 1800s who came to the United States during the potato famine, who was illiterate, who had no experience handling money because they lived in subsistence agriculture, who had no idea what the time of day was because they didn't work in a factory, never been to a city, never been away from his home. Half of them didn't speak English, by the way, they spoke Gaelic. They had no idea how to work in a modern society at all, suddenly moved to New York City in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. Not only do they have to learn a new culture, new norms, new language for a lot of them, they also have to learn what the hours of the day are, how to use money, how to rent an apartment, etc. Same thing for Italians who came from southern Italy, who were essentially landless. A lot of them were peasants living as lords, living under lords. Same things. I would argue that the difference between Americans and Italians and Irish back then is greater than the difference today between a Mexican immigrant in the United States, especially that Mexican immigrant comes from Guadalajara, knows the time of day, knows what hours are, knows how to rent an apartment, knows how to use money. The difference between him in Guadalajara and him in Los Angeles is much smaller than an Irish immigrant from County Cork in 1850 and an Irish immigrant coming to the United States in New York in 1850. Crime. What about crime rates? This is interesting. And I just take a look at violent and property crime rates. I exclude immigrant crimes like immigration offenses and nonviolent drug offenses. But if a drug offense was involved with a violent crime, I keep it in the statistics. The average native-born American is 4 to 5 times more crime-prone than the average immigrant. Interestingly, for illegal immigrants are 1/10 as likely to commit a violent or property crime and to be incarcerated for it as a native-born American. Now, what's interesting is second generation, those born here, the Hispanic incarceration rate does increase above average. That's absolutely true. But it falls back down by the third generation to the national average. Part of that, I think, is assimilation. America is a very violent country compared to other OECD countries, much more crime-prone. Part of it, if you want to look at it with a positive spin, is assimilation. Some immigrant groups, like Asians, their descendants never assimilate in that way. With some exceptions, they're much less likely to commit crimes. Cities with more immigrants and cities with a higher degree of second generation born there are far less crime-prone than cities that don't. Now, who knows if that's because immigrants cause that, or maybe they're just attracted to nice places and then make it nicer once they're there. But Los Angeles, the city I come from, has crime rates now lower than any time since the early 1950s. But about 75% of the city is either immigrant or the children of immigrants in that city. You contrast that with cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, and Buffalo, which have low percentages of foreign-born but far higher crime rates. We see this trend across the United States and across American cities with one exception, Miami, which is always an outlier on a lot of things, but that's the only exception. Over time, immigration is actually correlated with decreasing crime inside the United States. What about the rule of law? Well, this is something that's important, by the way, because the rule of law is a vital component to a free society, a successful economy, a growing economy. What does the rule of law mean? Well, first of all, what does it mean? Well, predictable outcomes, ex ante, equal application, and consistent with our traditions of liberty. Now, that third one is vital, because otherwise we could pass a law that says everybody has to wear an orange jumpsuit all the time. Now, that's predictable outcome, or we kill you. Predictable outcomes, equal application. That's clearly not consistent with our traditions, right? Or we could pass a mandatory death age or something crazy like that. So it has to have all of those three things. And this is from Hayek and Judge Posner and a few other legal philosophers. Now, I would argue that our immigration laws currently are neither predictable, nor applied equally, nor consistent with our traditions in the United States. The rule of law does not mean enforcing every law in the books perfectly. We have scarce resources we can prioritize. What it means is that the laws, an important component is that the laws must be respectable in order to be respected. Poorly crafted laws, I think, do more to diminish the sanctity and importance and value of the law, while the illegality created by such laws doesn't quite do that. Bad laws produce bad consequences. As according to Associate Justice Harry E. Hall Jr., immigration laws are second only to the Internal Revenue Code in complexity, and having, I think, good laws is more important than strictly enforcing the bad laws we have in our books, and we don't need to strictly enforce the laws we have right now before changing them. And that is the crux of the argument that a lot of people make, is we have to enforce our laws as they are now before we change them, otherwise we sort of give in to criminality. Well, we didn't do that with Prohibition, did we? And Prohibition was a pretty bad law. A lot of people were getting killed. Do you think enforcing that bad law to the point where there was no criminality or is very, very small and diminished, and then changing the law would have been the better outcome? I don't think so. I don't think that you can justify that on any grounds, ethical or utilitarian or consequentialist. What about our tax laws? Who in here likes tax cuts? Like lower taxes? Come on, man. Yeah. You're going to be working soon. Tax cuts are awesome. 25 to 40% of Americans are tax cheats. They intentionally commit fraud on their forms. Does that mean that we can't change the tax laws until we catch every one of them? No, of course not. We can change the laws because they're terrible. And we can do that right now. Bad laws are for changing, not enforcing. What about sovereignty? This is sort of a talk radio point, but it's made enough. Government has a right to control its borders. Illegal immigrants violate our sovereignty. Because they cross these borders without our permission, we should do this. First point, governments don't have rights. Governments have powers. Only individuals have rights. Bad application right there. Sovereigns, however, they do have the power to keep out other sovereigns, but they should not, under the classical liberal Enlightenment natural rights view of the state, destroy individual liberty. Governments are supposed to protect our rights. They're not supposed to infringe them except absolutely necessary to protect them. Sovereigns have the power to keep out other sovereigns, not necessarily to do other things like protect us from the scourge of people who want to work here and make money for us. Limited government, like we're supposed to have, the idea of limited government anyway, limits the power of the sovereign, and I think that's a good thing. And I think it would be good if the sovereign's power were limited in this regard. Another thing, the United States had open borders from 1790 to 1882. Open borders. Was the U.S. not a sovereign country then? Was the U.S. not a sovereign country when we fought the War of 1812 to a standstill, or the Mexican-American War, or the Civil War? I'd like to go back in time and tell Abraham Lincoln he didn't have a sovereign country because there was open borders back then. What about trust and social cohesion? This is sort of part of the the impact of like assimilation over time. Increased diversity could decrease trust and social cohesion, leading to lower economic growth. What's interesting, basically you sum up all this literature, this only has a negative effect in countries where the institutions are already terrible. So if you're in India and you have a bunch of bad policies and you have a socialist economy, more diversity will make that worse. You have a country like the United States with better institutions, etc., more diversity actually has a positive impact on growth. Interesting. It has nothing to do with it. So what about political assimilation? Are immigrants all going to vote for the Democratic or Communist Party or some other bad party? And I don't mean to toot the Republicans' horn; they're pretty bad too. But are they going to do this? So we can take a look at generations of immigrants and their descendants by political ideology. This is done by the General Social Survey, one of the largest surveys of people in the United States. In each of these surveys, there's about 60,000 immigrants, by generation who are surveyed. So first generation, the immigrants themselves, second generation, their kids, third generation, their grandkids, fourth generation is sort of the benchmark that I like to use for a perfectly assimilated, like, American. You know what I mean? Like, totally assimilated. First generation is in the blue here, and the numbers are up here at top too. So first generation, they are more likely to identify as liberal than other Americans. They're about as likely to identify as moderate as third and fourth generation, and they're a little bit less likely to identify as conservative than the third and fourth. Second generation, they're less liberal, more moderate, a little bit less conservative. Third generation, about the same liberal, about a little bit less moderate and a lot more conservative. Fourth generation, less liberal, more moderate, more conservative. You have essentially very good assimilation rates over time. These differences, by the way, are smaller. These are all basically between about 27% and about, on the wings here, liberal versus conservative. This is all between about 27% and about 34% of those reporting. So pretty small differences when you're talking about total numbers of population. What about party by generation? Democratic, Independent, Republican, and the poor others. Weep for the libertarians. By political party identification, however, first-generation immigrants are a lot more likely to be independent, less likely to be Democratic, and less likely to be Republican. So they're more likely to be independent. Second generation, more likely to be Democratic. I argue that's partly because of identity politics. It's more Democratic than what you would expect by their ideology. But they're also more likely to be Republican in the second generation. They're just a lot less likely to be independent. So they become, polarized like the rest of us pretty rapidly. Third generation, much less Democratic, much more conservative, about the same and independent. Fourth generation, about the same Democratic, about the same independent, about the same conservative. So you see party identification, assimilation, basically complete by the third generation. Politics. So, Hispanic vote for the GOP over time, 76%, 1976, 8%. Increases over time a little bit and then falls back down to 27% in 2012. Asians goes from 55% in 1992 to 26% today. A far greater drop over that time period. What's interesting is immigrants are not that likely to vote, not nearly as likely as other Americans, but they become political when they're threatened. And I can give you a prime example of that is my home state of California. In 1994, Governor Pete Wilson is a Republican running for re-election. He blamed illegal immigrants and a lot of legal immigrants for a lot of the problems in the state at the time. Prop 187 was a campaign also. We try to kick all the kids of illegal immigrants out of public schools. This won Pete Wilson election, and Prop 187 won on the ballot, but it poisoned the well for Hispanic and Asian voters in that state over time. In 2010, a poll by Latino Decisions found that 66% of Hispanic voters in California were very concerned that Pete Wilson, the same Pete Wilson from almost 20 years before, was Meg Whitman's campaign co-chair. Meg Whitman was running for governor as a Republican then. Here's just some more data on that. The relevant ones are the 1986, 1990, 1994, 1998, because those are the gubernatorial elections in California. You can see they basically split, here's the vote for the Dems, vote for the GOP, and Hispanics. They basically split the Hispanic vote, a little bit more for the Dems, but not that much in 1986. Similar in 1990 when Pete Wilson ran the first time. And then in the anti-immigrant campaign of 1994, catastrophic shift, 71% to Dem, 25% to Republican, giving the Democrat in the race a 4-point advantage off the bat. Pete Wilson overcame that. But in 1998, it so poisoned the well that it got even worse. 78% Hispanic support and voters for the Democrat, 17% for the Republicans, giving the Democrat a 9%, almost 9-point lead in the general election just because of that. I would argue that the reason why California went so Democratic so rapidly was because the GOP in that state declared war on the fastest growing ethnic group for to win one election. And it has muddied the pond ever since. You could draw a similar graph for Asians in California as well. So enough about political party. What we care really about is policy, right? Democratic Party did good things, that'd be awesome. It'd be awesome if Republicans did too. But it'd be really great if both of them did. So what we find is over time there's a positive correlation in the United States and globally between immigration and economic freedom. And that's even when we lag the economic freedom variable over time. Because of course more immigrants are going to go to freer countries, they have better economies, they grow more, etc. What about the impact over time? We even see that persisting for long periods of time. What's interesting is the federal government grew the fastest when immigration was closed to the United States. 1901 to 1930, mostly open borders to the United States. You saw a doubling during that time period of per capita expenditures by the federal government. Doubling. 1930 to 1970, practically closed immigration. So closed that the immigrant population of this country dropped from 14% to 4% over that time period. During that time period, however, in real per capita output, expenditures by the federal government grew by 17-fold. 17-fold. 1970 to 2010, when the borders were reopened slightly, you saw a doubling in per capita expenditures. If you're going to draw a correlation or a lesson from this, or you're going to claim that immigrants grow the size of government, all the data is actually in the opposite direction. Government, at least, is correlated with growing the fastest when immigration is closed off. So if you're going to make that claim, you have a lot of stuff to do. Here's that graph. This is in the middle is when immigration is closed off. On the wings, it is more open. Big old increase. During then, slight increase there. Big increase there too, but orders of magnitude less than what it was before during the period of time when it was closed. So I'm not saying that opening the borders will cause the government to shrink or anything like that. I'm just saying that it's not correlated with big growth in the federal government. Closed borders is. So what about libertarian theories? 3 broad theories I identify: natural rights, ethical intuitionism, utilitarianism, and consequentialism. First one, natural rights. Immigration does not violate the life, liberty, and private property of people. Natural rights draws no distinctions between aliens and citizens because rights precede the creation of the state. Immigration restrictions are human-created laws that infringe on our ability to use our life, liberty, and private property as we want. Ethical intuitionism. This means that if I do something that's ethically unsound, it's also ethically unsound if the government does it. If I lock you in my basement for smoking pot, it's just as bad as if the government were to lock you in jail for smoking pot. What's the ethical difference right there? The only thing is that the agents are different who are doing it, and the identity of the person doing it has no moral value or ethical value. That's one theory of libertarianism. Under that, blocking immigration doesn't make any sense because we wouldn't do the same thing to people in our own tribe of Americans. Utilitarianism and consequentialism. This basically is encompassed by economists in the United States. Immigration is a mutually beneficial wealth-creating economic enterprise. It's good. Founding documents. One of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence was that King George III obstructed immigration to the United States. Pretty interesting. Never hear that one in conservative talk radio. To establish U.S. Constitution, to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. Naturalization means the process of becoming a citizen. It does not mean necessarily immigration or migration. That is merely entering the United States. You might have the intent to stay permanently, but you can stay permanently without being a citizen already. This just means that they can control laws. If we're going to do like a strict interpretation of the Constitution, they don't clearly have the power to stop merely people moving here. How do we know that this is something that the founders, at least wrote about? There's a lot of quotes, but the Naturalization Act of 1790, the first such act passed, was an open borders law. It only guaranteed who can naturalize and when. Freedom of contract. Pecuniary competitive externalities are not an argument to close the borders. Even if immigrants lowered our wages, that would not be an argument from the classical liberal Enlightenment perspective to do anything about it. If you lower my salary because you become a better immigration policy analyst, under our common law system, there is a notion called damnum absque injuria. If you lower my wages by being a better immigration policy analyst, I cannot sue you for damages. That's part of being in a market economy. All right? We can put each other's businesses out of business if we compete. So shouldn't this same principle apply to people moving across the ocean? If they lower wages of Americans, it's like, I'm sorry. That's part of competing in a global economy. That's part of competing and making money in this system of free markets, that we have to respect this thing. Freedom of contract, that principle strongly favors letting all positive sum and mutually beneficial contracts that are voluntarily entered into stand regardless of the pecuniary externalities. Because voluntary couplings are assumed to have benefits. That's from Richard Epstein. Conclusion. Immigration is one of the most regulated portions of the American economy, almost as bad as the income tax. Wage and income compensation in the United States is equal to about 62% of GDP. If we like free markets, if we like free trade, if we like all these wonderful things, I suspect that we should deregulate and make open to the world this vast portion of GDP which is currently protected. People are the most valuable resource by far. Human capital in the United States right now has a present value of about $750 trillion. Physical capital, all the factories and computers that make junk, the goods and services that we like, only worth $45 trillion. I think it's my contention that free marketeers, whether libertarians, conservative, or otherwise, should support immigration reform that rolls back the government regulation of international labor markets. So I'm willing to take any questions that you all have.
Moving forward, what role does the government have in terms of dealing with current immigration system, in terms of, like, for instance, the guest worker program, visas, visa waiver program? Are those steps towards actualizing the system, or how do we scale back and actually get to that end goal?
Yeah, those are all steps to get toward there. I think the notion that we're suddenly going to have open borders or something close to it is insane. Most people don't want that. Almost nobody wants that. So I think a guest worker visa program, which is a temporary worker program, is a great step. Making it more possible within the current system for people to come here legally is a good step. Replacing quotas with tariffs on immigration is a good step. If you talk to anybody in international trade, you will know that quotas are more destructive than tariffs in just about every situation. These things, I think, could all move us toward that better situation. Now, in terms of what I think the ideal sort of immigration policy is, I don't think it's open borders, but I think it is restricting the movement of people who have a very high probability of destroying the life, liberty, and private property of other Americans. What does that mean? Suspected or actual criminals, violent or property criminals, suspected or actual terrorists and national security threats, people who have serious communicable diseases. I think you can make a great libertarian argument using every single one of those theories that I put up there for why those groups of people should be restricted, even in a perfect libertarian world. But the arguments for restricting a healthy person who just wants to come here and work do not hold up. Yeah?
What do you think about a pathway to citizenship for all the people that are here?
For the illegal immigrants here currently. So citizenship is something that I am more agnostic on. Most policy people are just obsessed with that issue. I think the legal immigration system is more important. But I would say that I think that if they're non-violent or property offenders, then they should eventually be able to naturalize and become an American citizen. I think at the minimum, however, and I wouldn't be too sad about this, is if they could just get a green card and live here permanently on that, but never naturalize. Because you remember, a green card is some step in between citizenship and being a legal immigrant, right? It's not just one or the other. You know, all immigrants who come here, like if they come here tomorrow, they're not a citizen. They're on a green card. They have to be on that for 5 years. They can't vote. Some states they can't buy a gun. Lots of things they can't do. So we're talking about naturalization. Related to that, birthright citizenship, I think is a very important feature of our system that has unintentionally helped second and third generation immigrants to assimilate faster. By giving them, even if their parents are illegal, giving them the full panoply of legal rights and obligations in the United States. And my example for that, the counterexample to that is Germany and Japan. Large populations of immigrants, illegal immigrants who came, had children who were not citizens by birth because they didn't have birthright citizenship. These kids and their grandkids are far more likely to be criminals, terrorists, to be political radicals, and by radicals I mean Islamists or communists. They don't identify with that country at all. Some of them don't even speak the language by the third generation. That's not a problem we have in the United States. And I suspect that part of the reason why we don't have that problem is because even if illegal immigrants are here, their kids at least can clear that assimilation hurdle legally. Yes?
I've also heard arguments that making immigration more open would also be more likely to reduce human trafficking. Do you think that's accurate?
I do think that's accurate. It's important to understand also to differentiate between different types of like human trafficking or human smuggling, right? There's a difference between the guy from El Salvador who wants to come up here and work, so he pays the guy $10,000, and the person who gets abducted off the street and abducted to be a prostitute and sex slave, right? I mean, we can understand the big differences. So people sort of lump all of them together until I sort of the nastiest part. But what we see is over time in American history, the prices that people are willing to pay to come here illegally increase as border security increases. So ironically, and what we've also seen is that these sort of mom and pop smuggler, you know, the guy who lives on the border, has a truck, drives people across, you know, he's not a hardcore criminal, he just does it sometimes for extra cash. We've seen them replaced as the prices go up and the security is increased on the border by the drug cartels who have an economy of scope. If you can smuggle a ton of cocaine, you can smuggle a lot of people in, and the drug cartels are not nearly so nice as people who would smuggle you across. So the average Mexican coming across the southwest border has to pay about $5,000. That's up from about $500 in 1992. Your average Central American, about $10,000. Chinese illegal immigrant, about $50,000 to come here. Yes?
What sort of things relating to immigration are you expecting from Obama and this lame duck session of Congress before the end of the year?
So I'm torn about what it is he's going to do. Like, to give you an example, Obama has been one of the most frustrating presidents on immigration for everybody. So in his first 2 years, I'm just going to give you a little background, then I'm going to answer your question. In the first couple of years of his, first 3 years of his administration, he massively increased immigration enforcement internally in the United States. Deportations went up, the amount of jurisdictions that had to give, you know, turn over illegal immigrants to the federal government increased, work site raids increased, all this stuff increased, border security increased, everything. Since then, he's dialed back internal enforcement and done more border enforcement stuff since then. In 2012, he did a temporary legalization of illegal immigrants who were brought here under the age of 16, they're not criminals, they're under the age of 30, a bunch of other characteristics like that. Temporarily legalized them for 2 years. He has that ability for a 2-year grant of that, according to federal laws and regulations. He might do that again and make it bigger. So he might, instead of making it just available for kids, maybe make it available for their families or some other groups. That's what I suspect he'll do. He could throw in something like, because part of the president's power is also interpreting statutes that are unclear. And there's a lot of immigration statutes that are really darn unclear about what they mean. And he could order the government bureaucrats to interpret them in a more lenient way to increase legal immigration, sort of de facto. I can give you an example if you want. There's 140,000 green cards available for high-skilled workers every year, but only about half of those go to the workers themselves. The other half go to family members. There's a line in the law that says the family members of these workers are also entitled to a green card, but it doesn't make clear where that green card comes from. So the government interprets it in a way that counts them against the initial cap of high-skilled workers. What he could say is, no, don't count them against the cap, count them against the family category, which is much larger. So he could de facto increase it that way, to give you an example. But if you recall, he said he was going to do a lot of things all this year and last year on his own. He said he was going to do executive action in spring of this year, and he said, no, I'm going to wait till late summer. Late summer came around, he goes, no, I'm going to wait till fall. Fall came around, he goes, I'm going to wait till after the election. And now members of his administration are leaking stuff to the press saying he's going to hold off even longer. So, as you can tell, he's a very frustrating guy for everybody.
That's actually all we have time for today.
I will hang around and answer questions, though.
Yes, and actually we have an afterglow. Well, first of all, thank you for coming today.
You're welcome.
But on that note,